Hello, everyone. Welcome to the lecture today on the Acts of the Apostles. So, this is the second volume of Luke's work, um, Luke Acts, how we normally refer to it. And we move from sort of the biography of Jesus into a history of the church and the spread of the gospel from that center of Jerusalem to Samaria to the ends of the earth. So before getting started, I do want to do a couple of housekeeping things. First of all, I'm not going to be able to get to everything in this lecture, so I do want to just mention that for any of the books that we are covering, if you're looking for information outside of what you find in Smith and Kim or what's presented here in the lectures, I would encourage you to check the commentaries, go to a commentary series, and you want to look for not only themes that are interesting to you, but you can also check in the bibliography section. Those will give you resources for other places to look if you want to dive further into any of the topics that we cover or topics that you think we should have covered that we didn't. And a second step to that would be if you have a topic specifically in mind, and here I'm thinking about the second paper and the third paper, and I want to encourage you to be doing that also. If you have ideas in mind of things that you would like to do, use the library's online resources. Use Atla or JSTOR and do searches for papers and essays, journal articles that are going to give you more detailed information on the things you might be interested in. If you're having trouble nailing down a topic, I think in the syllabus there's a reference to Bible Odyssey. That's an online resource where it starts at a very simple level. You can do a general search for something you're interested in, and it's going to give you a great starting place. It's going to give you sort of an encyclopedic entry and then some bibliography or places to get started beyond that. So, Acts is a long book. We can't get to everything here. We can't get to everything in any of the other books also. So please use commentaries, use the library's online resources. Be in touch with me to see if I have suggestions for other resources to look at. The other main piece of housekeeping I want to go over is considering that you have a paper due in 2 weeks, first paper of the semester, I'm going to remove the assignment for Acts, the exegetical worksheet. So there's not going to be an exegetical worksheet due this week. You don't need to meet with your reading group. You don't need to do that exegetical worksheet. Watch the lecture, do the readings, participate in the online forums, and leave it at that. I want you to be able to focus on that synoptics paper that's coming up, and to also encourage you, if you need some assistance with that, you can reach out to the Writing Assistance Center through the library. I've heard great things about that, so please, if you're looking for help, be in touch with them sooner rather than later, and you can always send me an email as well. So let's get started here with the Acts of the Apostles. The Acts of the Apostles contains it contains the only extant narrative of the expansion of the gospel from Jerusalem to Rome. So in our New Testament, if you want to talk about the geography over which the gospel travels and how it spreads, this is it. This is what we have. And it's the only biography of Paul. And what I should say about that is we want to distinguish what's happening in Acts, the way that Luke is portraying Paul's life, telling about Paul's missionary work. We want to distinguish that from what Paul himself says in his epistles. And by distinguish, I don't want to start from a place where I'm saying those things are completely different, but we need to bear in mind that Paul's letters predate Luke's biography of Paul. So I think last week we talked about Luke Acts being somewhere in the 85 to 90 CE range. Acts is going to be around the same time. Paul's letters date to the 50s and 60s primarily, and so we need to keep in mind that even though we're reading Acts first, as we read through our New Testament, we're reading Acts first, it is a later telling of Paul's life. So we got to keep those things in conversation with each other. What's the purpose of Acts? Is it a history of the church? Is it a biography of Peter and Paul? Is it a manual for life together? So the early church, the way they organized their community, the way they shared resources, the way they structured their assemblies, that sort of thing. Is it a manual for Christian mission, for how to disseminate the gospel? Is it a history of the Jewish and Gentile dilemma, right? So how do Gentiles become full members of Abraham's family? This is a primarily theological concern. It is a theological concern. How does Acts deal with that? And how do we put that into conversation with what we know of Paul's broader framework of thinking about Jews and Gentiles and God's kingdom and participation in that, and even how Paul differs from other people, from other apostles like Peter. There are competing interpretations of how Gentiles are, how they're incorporated into Abraham's family. Not just of that, but what are the mechanisms by which that happens? How does, for lack of a better way, how is this circle made wider? How do people come in? Is a concern for Paul and others who are spreading the gospel. Is Acts a biography of the Holy Spirit? As you read this in one setting, I hope you realize how often the Holy Spirit is mentioned as being poured out upon a group of people or upon an individual. Is it a manual for how to face persecution or bear witness to political powers? This occupies a prominent place in Stephen's martyrdom, but more so later in the book with Paul and the time that he spends in front of Roman officials and also the Jewish elite. Think about Acts, and this is a good thing to keep in mind when we're reading any biblical passage. Think about the polyvalence of the text. Think about the many meanings. It's not that a book has a singular meaning and that's the end. It's that there are multiple ways of looking at this, depending on your social location, depending on your concerns, the concerns of your church community or your academic community, whoever you're reading the text with. Think about the concerns present there, and think about the many impactful ways that a text can speak through a community given their concerns. And so we like to, biblical scholars, we like to use the word polyvalence, okay? What is this? There are several ways of thinking about the function of Acts in our canon, but also in terms of the narrative that Luke is putting together. So one of those would be looking at Acts as a bridge document, so between Jesus's circle of disciples, right, that earliest, the earliest community of Jesus's followers that's discussed in Luke, to the broader messianic movement of the ecclesia, which the NRSV typically translates as church. I am still trying to teach myself to avoid using the term church when I'm talking about this messianic movement at this time, because I think it's important to note that I don't think we can establish a clear separation between Christianity as a religion and Judaism as a religion yet. I think this is still in a stage where Paul is functioning within Judaism, and so I want to avoid the term church, which is typically where the word ecclesia, how that gets translated. I think that church carries connotations of suggesting that Christianity is a fully formed, distinguishable religion from Judaism. So I try to use ecclesia or community or assembly, something like that. I know it's a little clunky. Like I said, I'm still working on this myself. And I encourage you to think about this also. Is Acts a bridge between the community described in Luke and this broader spread of the ecclesia? Canonically, is this a bridge between the Gospels and then Paul's letters, right? Because if Luke and Acts are one volume, why do we have John in the middle there? There seems to be some significance with keeping the canonical Gospels together, and then you've got the book of Acts, and then you move into Paul's letters. Is it a bridge between the Jewish movement and the Gentile movement? This is, thematically, I think as you read Acts, note how many times that Paul is talking with Jews. He's talking in the synagogue, and note how many times that his message is rejected and he moves on to somewhere else. Note how the text does emphasize that Gentiles did receive Paul's message. They did accept this gospel message that Paul proclaimed, and a number of Jews did also. It's worth noting. Keep track of that as you're reading. Who accepts Paul's message, who rejects it, or who expresses further interest in it. An outline of key events in Acts starts out with the ascension of Jesus, followed by Pentecost, early descriptions of the church and its life together. There I just used the word church. Early descriptions of the ecclesia, of this community of Jesus's followers, and how they formed life together. You've got the martyrdom of Stephen in chapter 7, the story of the Ethiopian eunuch who has come from the Jerusalem temple, right? He has a scroll, he has an Isaiah scroll, which is completely fascinating. The conversion of Paul, and conversion might be a problematic term too. To convert, you leave one thing and you join another. Maybe we call this a transformation of Paul, or the epiphany of Paul, right? Paul, nowhere in Acts does Paul renounce his Judaism, his commitment to the law of Moses. Nowhere does that happen. So describing what happens in chapter 9 as a conversion, I think, is probably not the best way to talk about that. The story of Cornelius in Acts 10, a pivot from really focusing on Peter to Paul's work, Paul's missionary work in chapter 13. And finally, chapters 21 to 28, where you have Paul in a number of settings where he's on trial, he's in prison, that sort of thing. I've spoken about the way as an early self-identifier of those who embrace Jesus as Messiah. And this is just a list of texts in Acts that you can find that references the way. You can you can see this, study this after the lecture. So this book is called The Acts of the Apostles, but you'll notice that not all of the apostles are mentioned. In fact, really, it's maybe it would better be called The Acts of Peter and Paul. Paul's transformation narrative is told roughly 3 times. Getting ahead of myself. Yeah, so the first part of the book, chapters 1 through 10, you have Peter and a focus on his ministry in Judea and then moving to Samaria. And then you have a focus on Paul for the second part of the book, more than the second half. The remainder of the book, the bulk of it, is taken up with Paul and his missionary work, and then eventually his time in prison and defending the gospel. If we jump into looking at the text here, we start out with the prologue, and we talked about how Luke's use of a prologue in the Gospel of Luke and then the Acts of the Apostles is sort of a hallmark of Greco-Roman literature. Having this prologue, just laying out what you are doing. And here in the start of Acts, again, we have in the first book, Theophilus, I wrote about all that Jesus did and taught. So this mention of Theophilus, right? Is this an actual person? Is it a literary trope that's used? Theophilus, friend of God, lover of God, that sort of thing. And then you have this reference at the bottom. It says, after his suffering, he presented himself alive to them by many convincing proofs, appearing to them during 40 days and speaking about the kingdom of God. So anyone who's familiar with biblical literature should know that 40 is, right, a symbolic number. And Paul also seems to be making a case here that anyone who claims to have experienced Jesus after his resurrection, besides Paul, of course, is probably not speaking truthfully. There's something about this 40 days that those who have the true story of things experienced Jesus in this 40 days. And there are some scholars that have suggested that this is perhaps polemic against early Gnostic accounts, where Paul is making this claim. You have to have been there to know this. You don't have special knowledge outside of this event. Of course, then you have Paul. Paul wasn't among Jesus's disciples at this time, but he's allowed to have knowledge of this event. I guess for Luke, the important thing there would be that Paul did experience Jesus, right? In that what we call conversion, or that story of his transformation. So when we read about the prologue, we want to think about the Second Temple context. What we've talked about of being under the people of Judea, of Jews in general, being under Roman imperial rule, and this idea of expecting things to change for the better and to change soon, that there's going to be a restoration of Israel, of the kingdom of Israel, of God's people. And a lot of times this was accompanied by violent or revolutionary expectations about God's kingdom. So when they had come together, they asked him, Lord, is this the time when you will restore the kingdom to Israel? Right? There's the expectation. Jesus replies, it's not for you to know the times or periods that the Father has set by his own authority. You will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you. You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in all Judea and Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. So there's that broadening area in which the gospel is going to be heard and accepted. And that phrase, ends of the earth, is a trope that appears at the beginning of Homer's Odyssey. So I include this here just to tie in again. Luke is well versed in the Jewish scriptures through the Greek Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. But he's also conversant with Greco-Roman literature, and he knows this stuff. And so you get these allusions here and there where he brings this into his own writing. So the ascension scene, when he had said this, as they were watching, he was lifted up and a cloud took him out of their sight. Okay? So we need to unpack. There's always these two lenses we're looking at when we're reading this literature. We're looking at the Jewish context. We're also looking at the Greco-Roman context. So the Jewish context here would be that there is a precedent in the Jewish scriptures for heavenly ascension. Okay? If I were to ask you, who are you thinking of right now? I hope you would say Elijah. Maybe some of you will say Enoch. Okay? In Genesis 5:24, we have Enoch who, how does it say? He walked about with God, and the Hebrew word there is he walked about. It's not just that he walked with God. He walked about with God, and then he was no more, because God took him, and that was the end. Okay, so Elijah and Enoch are both taken up. But then we also have the Greco-Roman precedent here, and it ties in with, we've talked about emperor worship and the ways that emperors were able to have statues alongside the gods in the temples. Their images were nearly as prevalent as those of the gods. So there's this phenomenon when an emperor would die where they would be deified. We call this apotheosis. It's when a human being becomes a god and is taken up to join the realm of the gods, becomes a god themselves. 36 of the 60 emperors in the period between 14 BCE and 337 were apotheosized and received the title divus, so divine. What were the criteria for apotheosis? You had to have a witness, usually a senator, and then a senatorial vote, and a dramatic public funeral. And so the image you have in front of you is a depiction of one of these, where it usually involved burning an effigy of the emperor, and then you would release eagles at the same time. It was a big, this was a public, very public commemoration, celebration of the emperor being taken up. And you can see the eagles in that relief. You can see the coins here of Julius Caesar, Divus Iulius there. So Julius Caesar becomes a god himself. He becomes literally his son, well, I shouldn't say that. His stepson, Octavian Augustus, is the one who gets the Senate to officially vote on making Julius a god. And so then when Augustus takes the throne, when he assumes the emperorship, he can literally call himself a son of God. Josephus, the Jewish historian, writes in contrast to this that the Jews, they also take care of their dead with a decent burial, but it's without any extravagant expenses for their funerals and without the erection of any illustrious monuments. We also have this poem by the Roman poet Livy, who is writing about Romulus, the mythological founder of Rome. And it says here, and pay attention to the imagery here, a violent thunderstorm suddenly arose and enveloped the king in so dense a cloud that he was quite invisible to the assembly. From that hour, Romulus was no longer seen on earth. Those present hailed Romulus a god, the son of God, the king and father of the city of Rome. So here, there's the common imagery with Jesus' ascension as he's taken up in a cloud. And there's also this broader context of Jesus being proclaimed as the Son of God, as the true King, right, of the world, really, in a subversive way to the emperors, to the emperors of Rome, that we need to bear in mind as we read those texts. And then I would point out also that in the Capitol building, there's a depiction of the apotheosis of George Washington at the top of the Capitol dome there. So this is to say, Jesus' ascension is a theopolitical claim. Jesus is the true Lord of all. And what are the implications of this new king in the context of imperial Rome? And then again, in Rome, if this is such a political statement, in the United States, think of the place of eminence that George Washington occupies in our national memory and the way we construct our identity. And there's such a prominent place here. So think again about the theopolitical claim that we make as Christians when we proclaim the gospel, when we live into the gospel of Jesus Christ. Speeches and acts are a very important part of this work. 365 of the 1,000 verses in Acts are speeches. That's well over 25%. It's a striking feature of this. And importantly, it is similar to other Greco-Roman histories. Acts gives us the only extant recorded sermons by the apostles from the first century. There are no other sermons from these figures in the New Testament or in extra biblical works from this time. You can see a list of the various speeches that you find in Acts. And Luke is not doing something on his own here. He's again participating in the standard Greco-Roman practice of melding historiography and rhetoric, or speeches, direct discourse, and narrative together. You can see that in Homer. You can see it in the early pioneering Greek historian Thucydides, who's combining these things together. So it's not and I guess the question here would be, is Luke making something up? Is Luke recording what actually happened, right? Because this question occupies our minds. Can we rely on those speeches as being historically representative of what those figures actually said? Here's what Thucydides himself writes. As to the speeches which were made either before or during the war, it was hard for me, and for others who reported them to me, to recollect the exact words. I have therefore put into the mouth of each speaker the sentiments proper to the occasion, expressed as I thought he would be likely to express them, while at the same time I endeavored as nearly as I could to give the general purpose of what was actually said. Consider the technology available in this period, available to Luke. Is Luke able to have firsthand knowledge of what these figures said? And even if he was there with these figures, how was it being recorded? He didn't have a cell phone. He didn't have a recording device. He didn't have a notepad and pen. So we have to think about how we conceive of historicity when we're reading these passages. They may not be verbatim. They may not be a verbatim record of what was said, but they're the best recollections that we have. They give us a window into this early period of the gospel, and it's the best representative summary that we have of these apostles. It's okay that it's not verbatim, and Luke would be okay with that fact also, as would Thucydides, as would any Greco-Roman historian. All right, so there are three types of speeches that we encounter in Acts. We have the missionary speeches to the Jews, there are missionary speeches to Gentiles, and there are defense speeches that Paul mounts later in the book in front of Roman officials. What is the gospel according to the speeches in Acts? So there are 8 missionary sermons, and I'll just let you look at the list here. You can look at it after the lecture. So one way of assessing Paul's articulation of the gospel in Acts is to compare it to earlier articulations of the gospel that we find in his letters. So 1 Corinthians 15 verses 1 through 5. And recall again, I'll just remind you that Luke Acts is written later than Paul's letters. So we can study Paul's speeches in Acts and analyze how he articulates the gospel, but recognize that that's a later telling or presentation of that by Luke. So what do we have in, for example, 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 5? So Paul proclaims the good news to the brothers and sisters, namely that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and to the rest of the 12. So this is like a shorthand gospel. Paul's gospel it's fragmentary to an extent, and perhaps more complicated than we might imagine. You can't go to one place and find, Paul's comprehensive articulation of the gospel. It's fragmentary. You have to look either at the rest of the letter to kind of piece together a composite thing, or you look at Paul's other letters and you analyze what he says in other literary contexts and put that together. So how does Luke's presentation of Peter and Paul's proclamation reflect the Pauline letters' gospel explication? And if you're doing your focal text, or your focal text this week would have been on Peter's speech in Cornelius's house. You'll still read that because you're reading Acts in one setting, but you can analyze that for how Peter articulates that gospel and how that might line up with earlier articulations of the gospel that we have in Paul. Moving on to Pentecost. Then he said to them, "These are my words that I spoke to you while I was with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms must be fulfilled." And the Greek word there, dei, we talked about that last week. This is a theme in Luke where things must happen. And so in the story of Pentecost, this is a story of, the first empowerment for mission for the early ecclesia. The Spirit is poured out, and in the same way that the Spirit is poured out on Jesus in Luke 3:21-22, here you have the Spirit poured out on the early followers of Jesus in Acts 2. You have a unity of the Spirit being poured out on the early Jesus movement to empower and animate their mission. And keep in mind here, as there are references to the Jewish scriptures, the Old Testament here, keep in mind that the early Christians, the early followers of Jesus, they're not reading the New Testament, they're reading the Jewish scriptures. And so this is, these are the texts that are coming to fulfillment in the person of Jesus. The outline of Peter's sermon, it starts out with this quote from the prophet Joel. In the last days, God will pour out his spirit on all men and women. Okay, so there's inclusion of women and men in the mission of the church. We move on from Pentecost. We can talk about how Acts depicts the early community of followers of Jesus and what that looks like. So in Acts 2:43 to 47, you've got kind of a summary statement of what that looks like. There's devotion to the apostles' teaching, right? So they find the teachings of the apostles authoritative, and that's what they study. How did they do that? Are there writings? Is this word of oral stories passed down? And then you have this concept of koinonia, community, and it's literally fellowship, and it's what Jesus followers achieve and experience in their life together. It's God's work within that community. And then this concept of the breaking of bread is this. Do we think about this as in a Eucharistic context? Is this just the Lord's Supper, or is this broader table fellowship, which I think is what is suggested? Prayers are a central part of this, and they take care of one another. They take care of one another's material needs. So all who believed were together and had all things in common. They would sell their possessions and goods and distribute the proceeds to all, as any had need. So a couple notes on this. I remember in college, keep in mind, I was raised in a fundamentalist setting. And when I got to college, Bluffton University, a Mennonite university, I was studying religion, which I didn't start out doing. I ended up picking up a religion minor in addition to my history major, because I became fascinated with studying theology. And I remember reading this passage in Acts and thinking, why haven't I seen this? Why haven't I read about this? Why did no one talk about this passage to me while I was growing up? I found it completely fascinating that this early depiction of the community of disciples, the followers of Jesus, that they shared everything in common, and that people who had need in their community, they made sure that those needs were met. So some would ask, is this early communism? I would say maybe if you define what communism with a small c is, you might be able to go that direction. I would, given the context today, where we are in the ways that the word communism gets thrown around, I would be careful with using this because it gets misunderstood. And if we're talking about communism, capital C, as the way that Karl Marx depicted it as one of the stages of history, that's definitely not what is in view here. So we need to be careful with that. But if we define what communism small c is, and we find out that it means a community of people that are devoted and committed to one another, that make sure that everyone's taken care of, then obviously you can talk about that. And I would say we have another example of this in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The rule of the community, it's one of the extra biblical writings that was found at Qumran. It kind of talks about this entry ritual that anyone who wanted to join the community, what they did was they brought everything in with them to the community to benefit the community. And the way that the way that that scroll depicts it is not just that they bring in their material wealth and possessions, but it also says they bring in their knowledge and their wisdom. They bring their whole selves into this community to give themselves to the edification of the community however they can. So in that regard, I would say we have another parallel in Second Temple Judaism of a community that is committed to one another in a much more comprehensive way than I think what we typically have in mind. Worth noting, in the ancient Greek world, sharing possessions was a symbol of the ideal friendship, having all things in common. This is used in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. Okay, again, Luke has familiarity with the philosophical lingua franca of the day. In Greco-Roman conception, though, sharing of possessions happens between people of equal statuses, and the way that this early community of Jesus's followers, the way that this happens is without distinction to social status. So consider that. Consider what that means in this setting. It's unique to Christian identity, this sharing of possessions across socioeconomic statuses. If anyone is interested in looking at this further, you could start out with Luke Timothy Johnson's book, Sharing Possessions, and then there's another work. So, Life in the Christian Community. Again, I want to point out here, this is in Acts 4, the whole group of those who believed were of one heart and soul, okay? Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, and also, then this concept later on that I have in bold here, there was not a needy person among them, for as many as owned lands or houses sold them and brought the proceeds of what was sold. So the needy, the Greek word there, endeis, we find that in Deuteronomy. So as part of the law of Moses articulated in Deuteronomy, there's not to be a needy person among you. So just to note the Greco-Roman philosophical echoes that are here in Acts, as well as the Jewish law. So we have to talk about imprisonment when it comes to Paul. Okay, there's a statement from the Roman satirist Lucian, who writes about Proteus's imprisonment. Okay, from the crack of dawn on, you could see gray-haired widows and orphan children hanging around the prison. From as far away as Asia Minor, Christian communities sent committees, paying their expenses out of the common funds to help him with advice and consolation, legal advice, legal counsel. The efficiency the Christians show whenever matters of community interest like this happen is unbelievable. They literally spare nothing. And this is one example. There are other works out there. There's a Mennonite New Testament scholar at the seminary that I attended. His name is Ryan Schellenberg, and he's done a lot of work on Paul and imprisonment. His latest book is called Abject Joy: Paul, Prison, and the Art of Making Do. And I would encourage you, if this is something you would like to focus on, imprisonment in Paul's letters for one of your papers, I encourage you to look into that. It's really fascinating to see how involved early Christians were in primarily helping their own members who were imprisoned, but we do have texts that seem to suggest that when these groups of Christians would bring food or supplies or provisions to the jail, that they would share them with non-community members who were held there also. So doing any kind of research into this, you find out about, number one, how terrible Roman prisons were. It's nothing like look, American prisons are awful in and of themselves, but you need to read about the way Roman prisons worked and what a statement of hospitality and commitment it was for early Christians to go to these places, to share food, to share psalms, to read hymns, to read psalms, to sing hymns, uh, and to share that with those who are in prison. This is a fascinating topic if any of you are interested in looking at it further. So Peter's sermon in Acts, there's one thing that I want to point out in here. Peter is speaking in the context of Caesarea Maritima, which is along the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. It's a major Roman port in the province of Judea. There would be depictions of the gods. Of the Roman gods. There would be depictions of statuary figures of the emperors everywhere. And Peter gives this speech there, and he starts out, I truly understand that God shows no partiality, but in every nation, anyone who fears him and does what is right is acceptable to him. You know the message he sent to the people of Israel, preaching peace by Jesus Christ. This one is Lord of all. I underlined this one because the Greek word there is usually translated as he is Lord of all, and that can kind of obscure the fact that Peter is speaking in a polytheistic environment where there are many gods present, where the gods and the divine emperors, right? They're prevalent in space, they're prevalent in time in terms of celebration of various festivals. And Peter steps into this space and he's talking to groups of people, to Gentiles who would not be aware of the concept of thinking about just one God, let alone the God in Peter's conception. And so it's significant that when Peter is making this proclamation, he is saying, this one that I am talking about, this one is Lord of all. And then to look at how subversive that concept of Lord of all is, we'll get to that in a second. And I also want to point out here that Peter talks about this Jesus of Nazareth, who with the power of the Holy Spirit, he went about doing good. Ergateo, we talked about that last week. Benefaction, benefactors. Here, this is a concept that Peter's hearers would attribute to the emperors, to the people who are at the top of society. And here it's this Jesus. It's this Jesus that Peter is talking about, who does good. He heals all who are oppressed by the devil. He does these things willingly because that's who he is, not because he needs to satisfy some need for recognition. So this one is Lord of all. Just to focus in on this a little bit, Nero was regarded as Lord, and I just have several texts here that depict how Nero is referred to. Nero is referred to by Festus in Acts as our Lord. Okay, we have inscriptions that talk about the Lord of all the world. Lucian, okay, again, the Lord of the world in reference to Nero, the Lord and God of the entire earth, Epictetus, Lord of all. You have all of these Greco-Roman references to Nero as the Lord of all. So consider just the subversive nature of the language of Peter, making this theopolitical claim, right? He's talking about the peace of Christ, the peace of Jesus the Messiah. It's not a peace through coercion and violence like the Pax Romana. It's through Jesus' life, death, and resurrection that peace comes to all. So is Paul the theological architect of early Christianity? This is, there's great debate here. how did Paul conceive of his own work? What was he trying to accomplish? And then what actually happened with it? So concepts of Jewish and Gentile dichotomy, how does Paul conceive of these things? And I'm giving this list of something to think about. We're going to talk about Paul in much more detail after the short break coming up when we get to Paul's letters. But this idea, who is my neighbor? Okay, recall in Luke, the story of the Good Samaritan. That parable only exists in Luke Acts. Who can I eat with? How do Gentiles get into the family of Abraham? I'll give you a hint. It's not through circumcision, as some other apostles teach. It's through faith in Christ. That's the requirement for Gentiles to get into Abraham's family. The concept of justification. How does Jesus' death and resurrection reconcile people to God? What influence did Paul have on mission and how that is shaped in early Christianity, life together, and the church's relationship to the state? So we get later in the book, Acts 17, Paul's speech on the Areopagus. We get to this setting here. He's been giving talks in synagogues, and he's been proclaiming the gospel of Jesus to people, and some accept it, some don't. Some Jews actively hunt him down to make him stop doing this. And eventually he's hauled off to Athens to answer for this. And it's a great scene because Luke allows us to sit in on Paul's teaching style, to see what he does and how he contextualizes the gospel in various settings. So it gives us a window into Paul's proclamation of the gospel to the Gentiles. Okay, Athens, this is the intellectual center, the cultural center of the Greek world. You have to keep in mind highly sculptural environment. There's many, many sculptures, reliefs, impressions, depictions of the gods, of the divine emperors everywhere. It's a material religious culture, right? Religion is always on display. It's present in everyday life in terms of the space and in terms of the time. Life is ordered around this religious environment. And you're in this environment also where you've got multiple schools of philosophy that are competing with one another. Some of those being the Stoic, the Epicureans, the Peripatetics, the Cynics, right? You've got a whole host of them. And, some of these extend back 2nd and 3rd century BCE, but they also extend forward well into this period and beyond the 1st century CE. So you've got this center. Paul is put in this center of Greek and Roman life. And is Christianity on trial here? I think I mentioned last week that Luke presents this as, Paul as a new Socrates, or as Socrates come back to life. And there are a number of parallels that can be drawn between Socrates and what happens to Paul. Both wandering around, being wandering philosophers, both introduce foreign divinities into the discourse, the philosophical discourse of the time. Both are brought into a judicial setting before the Athenian tribunal. But what ultimately happens is that Paul articulates, in the setting on the Areopagus here, Paul articulates differences between pagan religion and Jesus devotion. And his main theme is that Jesus devotion is more philosophically consistent. Which I just have to say, I took a class on Stoicism while I'm working on my PhD. It was a couple years ago. And just in terms of the volume of writing out there, right? The Stoics are actually very systematic in how they lay out their philosophy. I find it to be more systematic and consistent than Paul's articulation of the gospel. That's just me. We could spend a lot of time talking about Stoicism, but I just want to point that out. I think rhetorically, what Luke is trying to do is show that Christianity is much more consistent than these competing philosophical schools. But that's my take on that. So, questions to ask when analyzing Paul's speech on the Areopagus, and you can see those in front of you. What's the narrative context? Who is the audience? What are the persuasion strategies that Paul uses, etc., etc.? Think about that early articulation of the gospel, 1 Corinthians 15, 3-5. How does Paul's articulation line up with or differ from that in this setting? And here's what we find. He starts out by saying, Athenians, I see that you are, you're very religious. Desedaimonia. What is he doing here? Is he doing a rhetorical strategy? Is he basically saying, I praise you because of your religiosity? It could be taken that way. Or is it a critique of superstition? I see that you're very, very superstitious. There's two ways to take that. I would like to take it as Paul being using an intentional rhetorical strategy to reach out to his audience, to make a connection with his audience as he begins to lay out his arguments. Okay, so then here's the outline of what he says. And I think what's important to note, nowhere here does Paul draw on the Jewish scriptures. Okay, there's no mention of anything from the Old Testament. And notably, when you read this, he does not mention Jesus by name, and he does not refer to him directly. Paul's rhetoric in this speech is kept at the level of speaking about the divine in a general sort of way, almost like, so here's my God, the God who made the world, in contrast to your gods. Okay, that's the level. But just to note what Paul does in this speech and what his strategies are, how he's trying to reach out. And there are some who accept what he says, and I like how there are others who said, we will hear more about this, right? They want to hear more about it. In 1728, Paul quotes some pagan poets. So we have, for in him we live and move and have our being, as even some of your own poets have said, for we too are his offspring. You can read this quote, in him we live and move and have our being, Aratus, Cleanthes, and the hymn to Zeus. This is a very early Stoic piece of writing. Zeus, Lord of nature, who governs the universe according to law, all hail. It is fitting to praise you, for we are indeed all your offspring. And what Paul does, after quoting this, he talks about how the Romans use various depictions. They use gold, silver, bronze. They use these materials to depict their gods. Whereas, and this is Paul speaking, my God, my God, is the creator of all things. And so human beings are the offspring of God. There's no need for these other things. We are all in the image of God. Human beings are the ones who represent God on earth. And in this way, he's trying to say, by using material objects to depict the gods, this is philosophically inconsistent. Christianity is more consistent than Christianity in its conception of the Imago Dei. And I shouldn't even say that. Judaism, in its various forms, okay, here's me adding a bunch of commentary here. Judaism in its many forms, holds, has one God that it holds to. This God, right? This is a more consistent theological articulation of the divine and human relationship here. So what is Paul's gospel in the speeches of Acts? It's the story of Israel coming to completion in the story of Jesus Christ, okay? And it's the resurrection. It uses resurrection as the linchpin for the gospel, right? There's this guy, Jesus. He is God's son. He is God's emissary on earth. He lived a life such as this. He died a death such as this. But the thing that makes him the Messiah, convincingly, the thing on which this all hinges is that he rose from the dead. And the other aspect of the other way that Paul's articulation of the gospel should be looked at is how its contextual flexibility in terms of what the setting is. Where does Paul find himself? Who is his audience? And how does he put together his articulation of the gospel given that context? And in the last chapters of Acts, we are given many depictions of Paul in prison, with the idea that Paul must suffer, right? The prison context of these chapters is prevalent. You can find that in other letters of Paul, especially Philippians. Paul is portrayed as testifying or mounting a defense in front of Roman officials. And we can also ask, why is Paul on trial in these cases? In short, it seems to stem from theological conflicts that he has with Jewish elite. You'll find that often in these writings. And what I want to emphasize here is he has theological differences with the Jewish elite, not Judaism as an entire religion. And if you keep in mind how we talked about the various kinds of Judaism in the Second Temple period and the various sects, S-E-C-T-S, the various sects of Judaism that form early Jesus followers, and the Gospel of Matthew being one of those. This is not Christians versus Jews. This is intra-Jewish conflict. The ending of Acts, we don't get any depiction of Paul's martyrdom. Why doesn't Luke narrate this? Would it distract from the true hero of the story, which is the people who continue to carry out this mission? Is it symbolic of the ongoing work that each follower of Jesus must take up? So a quote from New Testament scholar Luke Timothy Johnson: the ending of Acts is truly an opening to the continuing life of the Messianic people as it continues to preach the kingdom and teach the things concerning Jesus, both boldly and without hindrance. So, the story doesn't end with Paul's martyrdom. It ends with the reader coming to understand that we now embody this ongoing ministry of this guy, Paul. And that's what we're left with in Acts. One other thing I want to talk about before we bring this to an end, and I know this has been long. I did a search of the word synagogue in the New Testament. There are 56 total occurrences of the word synagogue in the New Testament. 60% of those are found in Luke Acts, and 34% are found in Acts alone. So, like the temple, synagogues were communal places where non-Jews, that is, Gentiles, also gathered alongside Jews. So keep this in mind in this first century context. Think about the landscape or the landscapes of a text. What are the implications of a landscape in terms of the relationship between humans and their environment? landscapes can be more than just how your flower bed looks in the front. Okay, that's typically what we think. Landscapes are landscapes are made things. It's anything that human beings interact with and they shape with their hands. So a cityscape can be a landscape. And one of the newer areas of biblical studies, and I'll admit I've only encountered this in Hebrew Bible studies, but I think it would be worth to carry this forward into the New Testament as well, is to think about the concept of landscape. And I'm not sure if it's reached the point of being landscape theory yet, but thinking about the way that characters interact with the environments that they're in, how their relationships, how human relationships are shaped by the environment, how those relationships, do they have an impact on the environment? How does that, how does that play out? What is the significance of the setting? And in this case, Luke Acts is very very urban, right? We get a lot of urban settings, and in Acts particularly, the amount of times that Paul goes into a synagogue, the amount of time he spends in the synagogue, how is his presence there characterized? Is he hostile? Is he intense? Is he persuasive? What is he trying to do? Is he trying to undermine the leadership? Who is he trying to persuade? And then note his persistence. The amount of times he gets kicked out of a synagogue only to either go back or go to another one. He spends time with these people. It speaks to his persistence in his mission, his dedication to his mission to be in these spaces, no matter what kind of resistance he comes up against. So just to think about this within broader arguments about how we think about Paul, which we will get to eventually. We're talking about Paul against Judaism, which is an older way, a much older and probably entrenched way of thinking about Paul. Are we thinking about Paul and Judaism, right? Two things side by side, or are we talking about Paul within Judaism? So be mindful of that as you're reading Acts. Pay attention to the setting, to where Paul and Peter are, what they're doing, who they're interacting with. You've got the voyages at sea in chapter 27. So many ways to think about landscape, urbanscape, cityscape, seascape, and what Paul does in those settings here. So I encourage you to think about that. This has been long. Thank you for sticking with this. If you have questions, by all means, please let me know, and have a good week.